The last time I ever trusted the sound of my mother's voice was the night she called me down for dinner. I was 14, home alone, or so I thought. My parents weren't due back for another hour, but I heard her, clear as day, from the bottom of the stairs. "Honey, come down, dinner's ready." Her voice was a perfect replica. The same warmth, the same gentle lilt. I smiled, thinking they'd gotten home early, and I bounded out of my room. As I reached the top of the staircase, I called back, "Coming, Mom!" I took one step down, and that's when I heard the front door unlock. My real mom and dad walked in, loaded with groceries, their faces tired from a long day. My mom looked up at me, confused. "Who were you just talking to?" she asked. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen on the stairs, staring down into the dimly lit dining room. The voice had come from there. It had sounded so warm, so familiar, so loving. But it wasn't my mother. And whatever it was, it had wanted me to come downstairs. I never ran down those stairs again. This happened when I was just a kid, maybe 7 or 8. My dad was in the military, which meant we moved around a lot. We had just settled into this old base housing, a 2-story duplex with peeling paint and a damp, musty smell that never seemed to go away. My room had this tiny closet, barely big enough for my clothes. From the very first night, I hated that closet. It just felt wrong. I'd kick the door shut every night, but sometimes I'd wake up in the pitch black and see it. Just a dark slit in the wall, cracked open an inch. I'd lie there, paralyzed with a fear I couldn't name, my heart hammering against my ribs until the sun came up. One night, I woke up to a sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching coming from inside the closet. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Like a dog wanting to be let out. Except we didn't have a dog. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the covers up over my head, praying for it to stop. But it didn't. It got louder, more frantic. I could hear wood splintering. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I let out a scream that tore my throat, and my parents came rushing in. My dad, ever the stoic soldier, flicked on the light and marched over to the closet. He threw the door open, ready to confront whatever was inside. And there was nothing, just my clothes hanging neatly. He told me it was just a bad dream, a nightmare. He even went inside, knocking on the walls to show me it was solid. But as he stepped out, his foot kicked something on the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was a single, long, black fingernail. It was thick and curved, almost like an animal's claw, but it was unmistakably a fingernail. He stared at it for a long moment, his face pale in the light of my bedroom lamp, before quickly slipping it into his pocket. He told me to go back to sleep, that everything was fine. But his voice was strained, and he never looked me in the eye again when talking about that night. We moved out 3 months later, breaking the lease. My great-aunt Clara never believed in ghosts. She called them poppycock, flights of fancy for the feeble-minded. She was a stern, practical woman who had lived through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. Nothing scared her, until her husband, my Uncle Ben, passed away. He died in their home, in their bed, from a sudden heart attack. Aunt Clara was devastated, but carried on with her usual stoicism. About a week after the funeral, she was in the kitchen, washing the dishes from her lonely supper. The sun had set, and the only light was the small lamp over the sink. She told my mom she felt a sudden chill, the kind that sinks right into your bones. She paused, her hands submerged in the soapy water, and listened. The old house was silent. Then she heard it. Footsteps. The slow, familiar shuffle of Uncle Ben's slippers coming down the hallway. Her heart leaped. For a second, she thought she'd imagined it, a trick of grief, but the shuffling grew louder, closer. She turned from the sink, her hands dripping onto the linoleum floor, and saw him. He was standing in the doorway, not as a transparent, ghostly figure, but as solid and real as he had ever been. He was wearing his favorite worn-out cardigan and his old slippers. But his face was all wrong. It was placid, empty, and his eyes were a milky white, completely devoid of pupils. He just stood there, staring at her. She said she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like an eternity. Then he raised a hand and pointed, a single bony finger aimed directly at the wall calendar hanging next to the refrigerator. He didn't say a word. He just pointed. Then, as slowly as he appeared, he turned and shuffled back down the hallway, the sound of his slippers fading into nothing. Aunt Clara stood there shaking for almost an hour before she got the courage to look at the calendar. He was pointing to a date 2 weeks from then. She circled it in red pen, though she didn't know why. For 2 weeks, she lived in a state of quiet terror. Nothing else happened. Then, on the morning of the day Uncle Ben had pointed to, Aunt Clara woke up, made her coffee, and sat down in her favorite armchair. She died peacefully in her sleep, right there in her chair. The coroner said it was a heart attack, same as Ben. She was a practical woman to the very end, it seems. He just came back to tell her when to expect him. I used to work as a security guard at a massive, empty warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a 10-hour shift, midnight to 8 a.m., and for 99% of that time, my only company was the humming of the fluorescent lights and the scuttling of mice. The job was simple. Walk the perimeter every hour, check the locks, and watch the monitors. The main office had a bank of 16 screens showing various angles inside and outside the building. One night, around 3 a.m., I was watching the screens, half asleep, when I noticed something on camera 12, which pointed down the long, cavernous main corridor. A ball had rolled into the frame, a simple red rubber ball. I didn't think much of it. A rodent probably knocked it off a shelf. I made a mental note to pick it up on my next patrol. An hour later, I looked up at the screen again. The ball was gone. I rewound the footage. There, at 3:17 a.m., the ball just vanished. It didn't roll out of frame. It was there 1 second and gone the next, like a bad video edit. A chill crawled up my spine. I tried to reason it away, a glitch in the system, maybe. I got up to do my 4 a.m. patrol, my heart beating a little faster than usual. As I walked down that same long corridor, my heavy boots echoing in the silence, I felt it. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. I swept my flashlight beam from side to side, cutting through the shadows. The corridor was empty. I reached the end, checked the lock on the massive bay door, and turned to head back. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle. A little girl's giggle. It echoed from the far end of the hall. I froze, aiming my flashlight in the direction of the sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" The only answer was silence. I started walking back, faster this time, my light beam dancing nervously in front of me. As I passed the spot where the ball had been, my light caught something on the floor. Scrawled in the thick dust was a single word: mine. I didn't finish my shift that night. I walked straight out, got in my car, and never went back. I don't know who the little girl was or what she thought was hers, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. My twin sister Chloe and I were inseparable. We shared everything, including a strange connection people always talk about with twins. When she broke her arm falling out of a tree, I felt a shooting pain in my own arm, even though I was miles away at a friend's house. But the most terrifying experience of our lives was something we shared while in the same room. We were 16, staying at our grandmother's old farmhouse for the summer. It was a creaky, sprawling place filled with antiques and shadows. One night we were in our shared bedroom reading by the light of our bedside lamps. Suddenly, Chloe looked up from her book, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't heard anything but the wind rattling the old window pane. "Hear what?" I asked. "It sounded like someone whispering my name," she said, her voice barely audible. We both sat in silence, listening. The house groaned around us. Then I heard it too, a sibilant, dry whisper that seemed to come from the darkest corner of the room. "Chloe!" It was a sound that didn't belong to any person I knew. It was ancient and thin, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. We stared at each other, pure terror reflected in our eyes. And then, my bedside lamp flickered and went out. A second later, so did hers, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I could hear Chloe's ragged breathing next to me. The whispering started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't my name. It was hers. Sarah. But it wasn't coming from the corner anymore. It was coming from Chloe's side of the room, and it was in my voice. A perfect, chilling imitation of my own voice. I reached out a shaky hand, trying to find her in the dark. My fingers brushed against her shoulder, and she let out a strangled sob. "It's not me," I whispered frantically. "I'm right here." The whispering in my voice continued, a mocking sing-song tone now. "Come play, Sarah." Chloe screamed then, a raw, terrified sound. And as she screamed, something cold and smooth, like polished stone, brushed against my other hand in the darkness. We scrambled out of the bed, tripping over each other in a blind panic, and fled the room. not stopping until we were huddled in our grandmother's room at the other end of the house. We never slept in that room again. To this day, Chloe can't stand to hear me whisper. And sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I think I can still hear it. That dry, ancient voice, practicing, trying to get the sound just right. When my daughter, Lily, was 3 years old, she had an imaginary friend named Peaches. It was normal kid stuff at first. She'd have tea parties with Peaches, blame Peaches for making a mess with her crayons. My wife and I thought it was cute. But then things started getting weird. Lily would talk about Peaches in ways that were unsettling. She'd say, "Peaches is sad today. His skin is falling off." Or, "Peaches doesn't like it when you sing. It hurts his ears." We tried to ask her what Peaches looked like, and she'd just point to a blank corner of the room and say, "He's right there. He's all twisted and long." The final straw was one afternoon when I was putting her down for a nap. I tucked her in, gave her a kiss, and turned to leave. As I was closing the door, I heard her little voice say, "Don't go, Peaches. I don't want to play the choking game today." I threw the door open. "What did you just say, sweetie?" "What choking game?" Lily looked at me, her big blue eyes full of confusion. Peaches likes to put his cold hands on my neck and squeeze until I see sparkles. He says it's a secret game just for us. I felt a cold dread wash over me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. That night, my wife and I went into her room while she was asleep. We stood in the middle of the floor and I said, my voice shaking with a rage I didn't know I possessed, "Whoever you are not welcome here. This is our daughter, our house. You need to leave. Now." My wife, who was much more religious than I, sprinkled some holy water she'd gotten from her mother around the room. It felt silly, theatrical even, but we were desperate. The next morning, Lily woke up and never mentioned Peaches again. When we asked her about him a week later, she just looked at us blankly and said, "Who's Peaches?" It was like he had been completely erased from her memory. I don't know what we did that night or what Peaches really was, but I know that for a while my daughter was friends with something terrible, and I thank God every day that it listened and left her alone. I'm a long-haul trucker. I've seen my share of strange things on the empty highways in the dead of night. Phantom headlights, weird lights in the sky, you name it. But one experience in the deserts of Nevada sticks with me, haunts me. I was on a stretch of Highway 50, the so-called loneliest road in America. It was about 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The world outside my cab was just a vast, inky blackness, punctuated by the stars above. My radio was spitting static. Suddenly, up ahead, I saw a flicker of movement on the side of the road. I slowed down, my headlights catching the figure of a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes like something out of a 1950s movie, a suit, a fedora. His thumb was stuck out, a classic hitchhiker. I wasn't supposed to pick anyone up, company policy, but this was the middle of nowhere. The guy looked desperate. I pulled my rig over, the air brakes hissing in the silence. He jogged up to the passenger door and I leaned over to open it. "Thanks, pal," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Thought I was gonna be coyote food for sure." He climbed in, bringing a wave of cold air with him and the distinct smell of ozone, like right after a lightning strike. I asked him where he was headed. "Just up the road a piece," he said vaguely, staring straight ahead. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I tried to make small talk, but he just gave one-word answers, his eyes fixed on the ribbon of asphalt unfolding before us. The weird thing was I couldn't see his face clearly. It was always in shadow, obscured by the brim of his hat, even with the lights of my dashboard glowing. After about 10 miles, he suddenly said, "This is me, right here." I looked out the window. There was nothing, just endless desert scrubland. "Here?" I asked, confused. "There's nothing out here." He just nodded. "This is it." I pulled over again. He opened the door and stepped out into the night. "Appreciate the ride," he said, and then he tipped his hat to me. For a split second, as he tipped his hat, the dashboard lights illuminated his face. He had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets. Before I could even scream, he turned and walked away from the road, disappearing into the darkness of the desert. I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't stop driving until I hit the next town, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The next day, at a diner, I told the old waitress what I had seen. She just nodded slowly, her face grim. "You gave a ride to the Shadow Man," she said. "They say he wanders that stretch of road looking for a way out. You're lucky he let you go. Most people who pick him up are never seen again." My sister Laura bought a house that was notorious in our town. It was called the Red Light House because for decades, no matter who lived there, a single red bulb would always be on in the attic window. People had tried changing it, even cutting the power to the attic, but the red light always returned. Laura thought it was just a local legend, a silly story to spook teenagers. She got the house for a steal. The first week was fine, then the knocking started. 3 sharp raps, always on her bedroom door, always at 3:15 a.m. She'd get up, open the door, and find the hallway empty. She assumed it was the house settling, old pipes, whatever. Then things started moving. A coffee mug would slide across the counter. A book would fly off the shelf. She was getting scared, but she was stubborn and refused to be driven out of her first home. One night I was staying over to keep her company. We were watching a movie in the living room when we heard a crash from upstairs. We ran up, our hearts pounding, to find her bedroom in disarray. Her jewelry box was on the floor, its contents scattered. And on her mirror, written in her own red lipstick, was a message, "Get out." That's when we called a paranormal investigation team. A local group of serious-looking people with a lot of expensive equipment. They set up cameras, EMF meters, and digital recorders. For hours, nothing happened. The lead investigator, a man named Dave, decided to try and provoke whatever was there. He stood at the bottom of the attic stairs and called out, "If there's anyone here, give us a sign of your presence." The house remained silent. He tried again, louder this time. "We know you're here. Show yourself!" Suddenly, every light in the house went out, plunging us into total darkness. We heard a blood-curdling shriek from the investigator's assistant, who was monitoring the equipment. Then, from the top of the stairs, we heard a sound that I will never forget. It was the sound of something heavy and wet being dragged across the floorboards. Drag, thump, drag, thump. It was coming down the stairs towards us. We all ran, a stampede of pure terror, piling out the front door and into the street. We never went back in. Laura sold the house at a massive loss to a developer who tore it down. They say that when they were demolishing it, the last thing to fall was the attic wall. And as it crumbled, the workers swore they saw, for just a second, a single red light glowing in the rubble. When I was in college, I rented a room in a rambling old Victorian house with 3 other guys. The place was cheap, which was its main selling point. My room was in the finished basement, which was always cold and had a faint smell of damp earth. In the corner of my room, there was a small locked door, about 3 feet high. The landlord said it just led to an old coal chute that had been sealed up decades ago and that he'd lost the key long ago. I didn't think much of it. I covered it with a bookshelf and mostly forgot it was there. Sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from behind the bookshelf. I always wrote it off as mice. It was an old house after all. One night I had a terrible nightmare. I dreamt that the small door was open and a pale, skinny arm was reaching out, its long, dirty fingers stretching towards my bed. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The room was dark and silent. It was just a dream. I told myself to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. A few nights later, I came home late from the library. The house was dark. All my roommates were either out or asleep. I went down to my room, and as soon as I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. The air was freezing, much colder than usual, and the smell of damp earth was overpowering. I flicked on the light and my blood turned to ice. The bookshelf had been moved. It was pushed about a foot away from the wall, and the small door behind it was wide open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring into that blackness. I could feel something staring back. I didn't even pack my things. I backed slowly out of the room, ran up the stairs, and left that house for good. I slept on a friend's couch for the rest of the semester. I still have nightmares about that pale arm and those long, dirty fingers. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night? What was it that came out of the coal chute? And is it still waiting in the basement of that old Victorian house? It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was something my grandmother called a memory stain. My grandfather passed away in the home he'd built with his own 2 hands. He spent the last few months of his life in a hospital bed, set up in the living room, looking out his favorite picture window at the garden he loved. After he died, the house was still empty. But every evening, right as the sun began to set, it would happen. If you were standing in the hallway looking into the living room, you'd see him. He'd be sitting up in the hospital bed that wasn't there anymore, his back to you, looking out the window. It wasn't a solid apparition. It was like a heat haze, a shimmer in the air in the perfect shape of my grandfather. You could see the outline of his thinning hair, the familiar slump of his shoulders. He never moved. He never turned around. He was just there, a silent, shimmering echo of his last days, forever watching his garden. My grandmother would sometimes stand in the hallway and just talk to him. She'd tell him about her day, about the gossip from town, about how the roses were blooming. The shimmer would never respond, but she said it made her feel less alone. She said he'd left a piece of his love for that house, for her, stained right into the very air of the room. It was never scary. It was just sad. A beautiful, heartbreaking reminder of the man we had lost. A memory stain, left behind for the one he couldn't bear to leave. The stories you've just heard are echoes from the quiet places, whispers from behind the veil. Are they tricks of the mind or glimpses into a world that exists just beyond our own? Perhaps the line between the two is thinner than we think. If you have a story, a moment that made the hair on your arm stand up, that made you question what's real, share it in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to like this video if it left you with a chill and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. Stay safe and always check the locks. You never know who or what might be listening.